This is the book we're talking about, or that I'm talking about in relation to Craig, The God Who Acts in History, The Significance of Sinai, by Craig. So for some of what I'm going to say will not be directly related to Exodus itself, obviously, but to some of the philosophical background to the issues around Sinai and the Exodus, which is what Craig is addressing in this book. And then with Craig's presentation, it will more specifically move into the actual book of Exodus itself. The motivating thing in Craig's book, because I felt I ought to just do a little bit of summarizing of it, because I realize that not everybody will have read it, and I hope that what I say may indeed stimulate people to get it and read it. So I thought I ought to do a little bit of an overview as well as responding and reacting partly along the way and more specifically at the end. But the issue that generates this book is the intriguing and puzzling fact that both Jewish and Christian scholars insist that the Exodus Sinai event in the Old Testament are core, absolutely fundamentally core to Jewish and to Christian faith and religion. This is massively generative of faith and of ethics. And yet, the same scholars who affirm such things are frequently skeptical and agnostic about what actually happened, and indeed whether it happened at all. The historicity of the Exodus and Sinai events are very controversial, and many people simply say, well, we just don't know exactly what happened or whether it happened. And linked to that, in what sense, if at all, was God involved? Did God actually speak and act in Exodus and Sinai? So the Bible states unequivocally that God did both act and speak, and yet scholars seem very reluctant to affirm that. And so Craig's question is, why is that? It's not just because of the complexity of the texts, which everybody acknowledges that the Pentateuch is indeed a complex volume, but as Craig really works through the book to uncover and to expose to us, because of the philosophical presuppositions that so many scholars make, which are often unacknowledged, but they're there in the background and they go back a very long way indeed, much further than some of us may have imagined. The book begins with a chapter on exploring a recent book by a Jewish scholar, Benjamin Sommer, 2015, so quite recent, called Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition. So it's a Jewish scholarly work about Sinai in that tradition, in which Sommer tries to marry a historical critical approach to Pentateuch, which accepts and endorses the documentary hypothesis, for example, and other critical theories, and to marry that with Jewish faith and tradition, and does so in a way which in the end comes to the conclusion that God doesn't actually speak and act, at least not in the way that the text describes, but rather that there is a participatory kind of revelation going on in which God has influenced Israelite thought and imagination in such a way as to generate revelation. And Sommer goes back as the roots of this kind of thinking to the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, who argued that speech cannot be attributed to God, who is the perfect being, any more than walking or eating or smelling or any of the other anthropomorphic descriptions of God can be. So there's a strong influence of Maimonides and also to some extent of Kant in there. That leads Craig then to say, well, let's then look at these medieval philosophers and their legacy. And so he has a chapter on two medieval Jewish philosophers who are very different. The more famous one, Maimonides, of the 1135 to 1204. So we're talking about 12th century medieval philosophy. A Jewish philosopher in Spain who was heavily influenced on the one hand by Aristotle and Neoplatonic philosophy, but also to some extent by the Islamic cultural reality in Spain at that time, and therefore argues that God is his simplicity, his unity, his necessity, and the apophatic tradition that really we have to speak of God only in negative terms. We can't know him as he is in himself. He doesn't speak or reveal. It's a philosophical, intellectual concept of God that comes through Maimonides. Craig explores another lesser known Jewish philosopher of the same era, slightly earlier, called Halevi, who sees, no, that revelation is central to our true knowledge of God. Philosophy is valuable, but philosophy has to put revelation first and not let philosophy replace religion. So Craig sees in the contrast between these two medieval Jewish philosophers almost a kind of mirroring or anticipation of a contrast similar to that between, say, the historical, critical, dominant school of biblical criticism, even to this day, on the one hand, which owes so much to Maimonides, and on the other hand, what you might call a more reformed epistemology, people like Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Walterstorff and others, who would prioritize God and his revelation, then can be understood philosophically, but you start, as it were, with God. Craig then moves on to major chapters on Aquinas, who he sees as a Christian parallel to Maimonides, just about a century later, the 13th century, and the development of the classical theism, which in a sense merges the Aristotelian God as the perfect being, whom we can know through unaided reason to a certain extent, and then God will perfect our reason with the grace that reaches down in order to give us a fuller understanding. And this then becomes a very powerful dominating paradigm through Christian classical theology from then on into classical theism. So a chapter there on Aquinas. Then he moves in 2 chapters to the early modern era and to the, in some ways, the fathers of Enlightenment rationalism, chapter on Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish Dutch philosopher, and Immanuel Kant, of course, the great Protestant thinker and philosopher. These two, many ways, fathers of Enlightenment rationalism, and in Spinoza's case, a kind of monistic pantheism, that God doesn't act, God doesn't speak. God is simply, as it were, the source of the universe. It all exists in him and he is it. And it's the moral message of the scriptures that we need to take. The scriptures themselves are, in that respect, purely human constructs, which need to be studied with all the tools of the historical critical method, which in some ways go back to his thinking. And then, of course, probably more familiar to us, the work of Immanuel Kant, with the autonomy of human reason, and a God who is the God of a conceptually absolutely pure religion and the categorical imperative. And when those things are prioritized at an intellectual level, then in a sense, history becomes interesting but unimportant. History cannot and does not generate revelation. We don't know God through history. We know God through the absolute principles of intellectual philosophy. So historical events in the Bible, like Sinai and Exodus, are of interest to historians and philosophers, but they're irrelevant for faith and theology and morality. Reason alone is sufficient for religious faith and action and ethics. And that then generates the biblical critical school, beginning with people like De Wet, and on through into so-called modern historical criticism, the documentary hypothesis, and all that flowed there with that alleged so-called objectivity, that this is all being done by unaided reason, and therefore it's perfectly objective, it's perfectly neutral. And of course, what Craig is saying is, no, it isn't. It has got very powerful philosophical assumptions behind it, which are a priori and not at all in themselves proven or indeed provable. From there, for that sort of survey of medieval and early modern philosophy, Craig moves with what he calls a kind of breath of fresh air or a glass of cold water to Colin Gunton in chapter 7, and Gunton's very strong critique of these assumptions that lie behind classical theism, including that of Aquinas within the Christian tradition, and of course even more strongly that which comes through in the Enlightenment and later Protestant tradition. A very strong emphasis on the Trinitarian nature of God, as distinct from the more monistic, pantheistic, deistic view of the philosophers, and that God is as personal as he is described particularly in the Old Testament. In fact, he, in a sense, reinstates the importance of the Old Testament for our understanding of God, and we must start with revelation. He places a very high value on that which was least valued in the philosophical tradition, namely the anthropomorphic language of the Old Testament especially, saying that because we are made in the image of God, it's not just, in a sense, something we have to accept as a lesser good, but something which is actually the highest form of communication, which is to speak of God in human language and in human analogies and in the anthropomorphic way, that this is the way of talking about God, not the philosophical or the abstract way. That reminded me, by the way, just a little sort of digression at that point, when I read that part of his chapter, it reminded me very much of at least some of us who have been reading this other book by Leon Cass, Finding God's Nation, reading Exodus, because one of the fascinating things in his book on page 16 and 17 is when he talks, he has what he calls a few words about God. That's how he describes it, about how he's been reading Exodus. And I just quote him because it seems to me that in a sense he's almost echoing Colin Gunton's point, and the point, of course, that Craig is coming to himself later in the book, that almost anyone who comes to the Bible comes with some notion about God. Whether we believe in him or not, we think that this entity called God is by definition eternal, unchanging, omniscient, omnipotent, incorporeal, ineffable, infinite, and so on. And to my great surprise, Cass goes on, I discovered that none of these attributes which were given to God by medieval theologians are predicated of him in the biblical text. In the places where he gives Moses a glimpse of himself, these are not at all the attributes that are mentioned. So my modest suggestion, born not of philosophy or theology, comes from reading the text. Surprise, surprise, who'd have thought it? No question, God is the prominent character in the story. He plays decisive roles in delivering his people, feeding them in the desert, forming a covenant, giving them laws, and so on, and forming this relationship with Moses. So as a reader of the Bible, invited from the start to hear the words and to watch the doings of this special character called God, I find myself always in Moses's position. Who is this mysterious voice speaking to me out of the text? And the answer that Moses gets is the one we should take to heart. I will be what I will be. Do not ask for my being or essence or my existence or my person. Pay attention to what I say and what I do. That, according to the text, is the way of coming to know the character of the God who is variously called Elohim or Yahweh. And I thought that quote from Cass was exactly the kind of thing that Gunton is saying, that this is how we know and find God. I need to keep moving. So having worked through from Maimonides right through to Colin Gunton, Craig then goes on to a chapter on models of divine action. How can we then conceptualize the way God acts? And mainly this chapter is a study of providence, providence within the doctrine of creation, making strong use of Karl Barth, and the necessity of seeing the universal character of the biblical meta-narrative, with its beginnings in creation and its centering in Christ, and the point that the God we know is the God of the biblical story of creation, Sinai, Calvary, the empty tomb, and the eschaton. God is portrayed as active, as agent within his own creation, preserving, accompanying, and ruling in a purposeful way, in a providential, purposeful way within his creation. And again, that reminded me of something. I was just reading that part of Craig's point of God's involvement and how rich it is when the Bible describes it. And being, at least now, an Anglican, I was born and brought up Presbyterian, but I, as one of my aunts in Northern Ireland said, I changed my religion and became as ordained as Anglican. But of course, most of us who are Anglicans know the general thanksgiving, a wonderful prayer that was actually composed by Bishop Reynolds, the Bishop of Norwich, in the 1660s. So it goes back a long way. But it's a prayer which gives thanks to God for all your goodness and loving kindness. We bless you for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all for your immeasurable love in the redemption of your world by the Lord Jesus Christ, for the means of grace and the hope of glory. It's a wonderful prayer that, it says, begins with creation, moves through the Bible story, comes to Christ, and goes right on to the hope of glory. The general thanksgiving of the Book of Common Prayer, if you want to follow that up later. So how then to understand special divine activity in relation to providence is the theme of that chapter, and also how to understand it in relation to scientific understandings in the worldview, because so often that historical critical viewpoint, which in a sense brackets out any idea of God, does so, but on the assumption that if we're going to be truly scientific, then we can't, as it were, let God into the equations. And so he then discusses some of the very helpful materials of Alvin Plantinga and others, saying that the Bible is not in conflict with science per se, but with the kind of naturalistic ideology, the rationalism, the materialism that is often presumed to be scientific, but goes philosophically much beyond what science can actually say. That there are these philosophical a prioris, which are not really as self-evident as they seem, and do not defeat, in a philosophical sense, what Plantinga calls warranted belief in a biblical sense. And that finally leads Craig to a chapter at the end of the book on understanding Exodus chapters 19 to 24, God's special divine activity at that time. And here I find fascinating that what Craig does is he both locates that narrative after very thorough literary and structural analysis of it, but he locates it within the ancient Near Eastern context, where in the ancient Near East, in Egypt or Mesopotamia, everybody believes in gods who act and speak one way or another, although it's a bit confusing exactly how they do and what they say, because that's confusing. But God or gods do get involved in human life. But what Craig points out very clearly is that the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, presents a God who does this in unique ways and in an incredibly powerful, almost revolutionary sense. That the concept of redemption, of covenant, of law, these are things which in a sense fit within an ancient Near Eastern context, the treaty context and all of that, but burst it wide open. God's when they were slaves and so on. And he notes how Israel is revolutionary in the way they adopted many ancient Near Eastern patterns of thought and practice in their awareness and language about God, but also how they break through it in the socio-ethical scope and the imperative force of the covenant and the law. And that's where I come to, in some ways, my own response to this, because that reminded me, reading of that ancient Near Eastern background, and how unique, revolutionary, and distinctive Israel was, even though clearly located in their own context. With a book which I read thoroughly and reviewed a long time ago now, some of you may remember this one, The Tribes of Yahweh, a sociology of the religion of liberated Israel, basically in the pre-monarchic era of the judges, by Norman Gottwald, who is a sociologist. And it's a massive account, sociological account of pre-monarchical Israel, in which he argues, in somewhat on a Marxist kind of ideology, but argues very thoroughly from the text and the evidence and the archaeological background and so on, argues for the revolutionary character of what he calls the egalitarian economics and politics that are there in the Israelite law and their economic system, as distinct from the kind of politics and economics that were there in the Canaanite city-states or in the Phoenician, any of the surrounding cultures. That Israel, as he would put it, was a remarkable historical social experiment with all that they were trying to do. And I think he's right. I think there's some amazing stuff that he's come to light. But here's the point for Gottwald: Yahweh, the God who is in all of these texts, is in a sense simply a servo mechanism, to use his words. The Yahwism is simply the ideology which supports the social experiment. In other words, for Gottwald, Yahweh is the kind of God he's portrayed to be because Israel was or was aspiring to be that kind of society, because Israel wanted to be a society of equals and of economic distribution and all that he goes into. They, in a sense, they invent this God Yahweh who endorses it all, who sanctifies it all, who mandates it all. So Yahweh becomes the landowner, he becomes the chief judge, he becomes the king, and he is put in that place and everything else gets relativized. So he sees Yahwism as purely a kind of purely an ideology which is invented. They create this God because of this sociology, and he's very critical of biblical theology, which assumes that God is real, or that God actually says or does any of these things. My view really is it's almost a mirroring of Gottwald, to say Gottwald got it right, but totally the wrong way round, if you see what I mean. that in fact Israel was, or at least aspired to be, the kind of society they did, precisely because Yahweh is and was and still is and did and said all the things that the Bible says that he did. So Israel was the kind of society they were because Yahweh is the kind of God that he is how I would want to put it from a faith perspective rather than Gottwald's way. And as I come to a more personal conclusion, in some ways, I found Craig's book, how can I put it, comforting. It may sound a strange term to use in reading a solid book of this sort, because it does take a lot of reading. It's a chunky book with it really demands quite a lot of philosophical attention and Craig's usual diligence. I found it kind of comforting because, and this is a sort of personal testimony bit, I started out my theological studies and certainly launched into my PhD way back in the 1970s, believing that I was called into academic theology. I was responding in some ways to what we were hearing, those of us who were in university at that time, from people like John Stott, John Wenham, J.I. Packer, Michael Green, F.F. Bruce, Howard Marshall, and others, these sort of giants of post-war 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s and 70s evangelicalism in Britain. And they were saying things like, we need more evangelicals to go into theology and to teach theology in the university, to do the biblical studies, to counteract all this kind of liberal understanding of the Bible. And I responded to that and felt, okay, Lord, that's what I'll do. But while I was doing my PhD in those years, I found myself becoming increasingly disillusioned with something of the kind of academic coldness of the whole thing, or at least, if not coldness, it all sometimes seemed like a game. We were told we had to exercise critical distance, we had to discuss the text and the history, bracketing out any idea of God talk, other than simply God being a character in the story, but not a reality to be taken into account. And of course, I could understand why that was necessary. I understood the reason for proper exegetical, historical, contextual study of the text and all of that. I got all of that. But it seemed to me that the whole thing was, as I said, removing issues of truth or of ethical implication or of missional implication, not that missional wasn't a word in those days, but you know what I mean. And now what I understand is, in a sense, that whole way of thinking, which I found cold and unconvincing. And I would have to say too, that I was finding that as a younger evangelical scholar, that I found the whole, for example, the whole documentary hypothesis simply unconvincing. I don't think it was because, I was evangelical and I wasn't supposed to believe that kind of thing, or I just read Ken Kitchen, Ancient Orient and Old Testament. I genuinely find that it didn't make sense. And it wasn't much help, either exegetically or hermeneutically, or certainly not homiletically. And so now I realize, in a sense, where the roots of so much of that was. I knew that, of course, a bit at the time, but Craig, in some ways, has laid it out even more carefully. So the result of that disillusionment was that I chose to stay in theology, but to get ordained in the Church of England and to determine to teach theology in a pastoral or seminary context where the people I would be teaching and engaging with actually wanted to know something about God and actually wanted to serve God in ministry, so that there would be still a commitment to, yes, academic integrity, awareness of all the critical tools and responsible use of them and responding to them. So it was not a kind of obscurantist fundamentalism that I was embracing. It was a proper use of critical tools, but within a confessional and faith basis. And in some ways, that has been my career, of course, ever since, both in India and at All Nations, and now within the Langham Partnership. And so Craig's book, in a sense, comforts me to think that was a good and wise choice. And so when in the end I was asked to work on this book, the Story of God Bible Commentary, the whole way in which this was described to me as what the commentary was doing and for appealed to me, because it was saying, and this Tremperlong, when I said, what you're asking me to do is to write with critical and academic integrity, as somebody who understands the issues that are there, but to write for believers, to write for those who actually think that, yeah, God is there and God does speak and God did act. And that's why I think that liberty to write in that way is a wonderful thing. And to have, in a sense, the philosophical justification and foundation for it in a book like this, I have found very encouraging. So, Dave, I think that's where I'll stop.